The day Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell walked into Fort Braxton's command center, Colonel James Harrison took one look at her and smirked. 23 years old, fresh out of West Point, and standing barely 5'4" in her crisp uniform. Harrison had been running military operations since before she was born, and he wasn't about to let some rookie with a college degree tell him how things worked. What he didn't know was that in exactly 7 years, she would be sitting in his chair, wearing his rank and making decisions that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The North Carolina morning was thick with humidity when Sarah Mitchell stepped off the transport truck at Fort Braxton for the first time. Her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, she surveyed the sprawling military base that would be her home for the next several years. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the pine trees that surrounded the installation, creating an oddly comforting scent that she would later associate with the beginning of everything. Sarah had graduated third in her class at West Point, specializing in strategic operations and military intelligence. Her professors had praised her analytical mind and her ability to see patterns others missed. But standing on the hot asphalt of Fort Braxton, watching seasoned soldiers move with practiced efficiency, she felt the weight of inexperience settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. The base was a maze of concrete buildings, training facilities, and equipment yards that stretched for miles. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors beating a steady rhythm that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. Sarah adjusted her cap and made her way toward the main administrative building, her boots clicking against the pavement with each determined step. Colonel James Harrison was in his office reviewing training schedules when his aide knocked on the door. "Sir, the new lieutenant is here for her orientation briefing." Harrison looked up from his papers, his weathered face showing the lines of 25 years of military service. At 48, he was a career soldier who had earned his rank through deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, through late nights coordinating complex operations, and through making the kind of split-second decisions that kept his soldiers alive. He had no patience for fresh-faced officers who thought their textbook knowledge could replace real-world experience. "Send her in," he said, not bothering to look up from his desk. Sarah entered the office with the precise bearing she had been taught at the academy. Her posture was perfect, her uniform immaculate, and her salute crisp. "Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell reporting for duty, sir." Harrison finally looked up, and Sarah caught the brief flicker of surprise in his eyes before it was replaced by something else entirely. He took in her slight frame, her youthful face, and the way she stood with the rigid formality of someone who had never been tested in the field. "At ease, Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying the tone that somehow managed to be both professional and dismissive. "So you're the West Point graduate they've assigned to my intelligence unit?" "Yes, sir. I'm looking forward to contributing to the mission." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same intensity he might use to evaluate a piece of equipment. "Tell me, Mitchell, what do you know about real military operations? The kind that don't come from textbooks or classroom. Simulations?" Sarah felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand that practical experience is invaluable, sir. I'm here to learn and to serve however I can best support the unit." "How old are you, Lieutenant?" 23, sir." Harrison nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. 23. "When I was 23, I was dodging mortar in Fallujah. I was making decisions that meant the difference between soldiers coming home or coming home in body bags." "What have you been doing, Lieutenant? Writing papers about theoretical combat scenarios?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Sarah felt the familiar surge of frustration that came whenever someone questioned her qualifications based on her age or appearance. She had worked twice as hard as most of her male classmates at West Point, had scored higher on strategy exams, and had earned her commission through merit, not favoritism. I've been preparing myself to serve my country to the best of my ability. Sir, she replied, her voice carrying just a hint of steel beneath the required respectfulness. Harrison's smile was thin and cold. Preparation. That's a nice word for it. He stood and walked to the window that overlooked the training grounds. Let me explain something to you, Lieutenant. This isn't West Point. This isn't a place where you get graded on your ability to memorize field manuals or write strategic assessments. This is where real soldiers do real work. And real work requires real experience. Sarah watched him as he spoke, noting the way he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned, never been challenged. She could see the ribbons and medals on his uniform, the visible proof of his service and sacrifice. But she could also see something else in his posture, a man who had grown comfortable with his authority, perhaps too comfortable. I understand that, sir. I'm ready to learn from experienced officers like yourself. Harrison turned back to face her, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something almost like pity in his expression. Are you? Because in my experience, officers who come straight from the academy with their heads full of theories and their uniforms still creased from the store tend to be more dangerous than helpful. They think they know better than the people who've actually been doing this job for decades. The words were delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had said similar things before. Sarah felt each word like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure. She had faced skepticism before, had dealt with instructors and fellow cadets who doubted her abilities. But something about Harrison's tone, about the way he seemed to dismiss her entire existence, sparked something deeper than frustration. I'm not here to prove anything to anyone, sir, she said quietly. I'm here to do my job. Your job, Harrison repeated, as if the words themselves were amusing. Do you even know what your job is going to be, Lieutenant? Let me enlighten you. You're going to be filing reports, updating databases, and maybe, if you're very lucky and very careful, you'll get to sit in on some briefings where actual decisions are made by actual experienced officers. Sarah felt the weight of his dismissal settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had expected challenges, had prepared herself for the difficulty of proving herself in a male-dominated environment. But she hadn't expected to be written off so completely before she had even had a chance to demonstrate her capabilities. I understand, sir. Where should I report for my first assignment? Harrison moved back to his desk and picked up a file folder. Captain Rodriguez will show you to your workstation. You'll be working under Lieutenant Peterson in the Intelligence Analysis section. Your primary responsibility will be organizing and cataloging reconnaissance reports from field units. Think you can handle that, Lieutenant? The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, but Sarah simply nodded. Yes, sir. Good. And Mitchell? Harrison looked up from his papers with an expression that managed to be both paternal and patronizing. A word of advice. Military leadership isn't something you learn from books or earn through test scores. It's something you prove through actions, through earning the respect of the soldiers who serve under you. Until you've done that, you're just another officer with a college degree and a lot of untested theories. Sarah saluted and turned to leave, but Harrison's voice stopped her at the door. Oh, and Lieutenant? Welcome to the real Army. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Sarah alone in the hallway with the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She stood there for a long moment, processing what had just happened. She had known the transition from academy to active duty would be challenging, but she hadn't expected such immediate and complete dismissal. Captain Rodriguez appeared at her elbow, a sympathetic smile on his face. Rough first meeting? Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked at him with clear eyes. Nothing I can't handle, sir. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That's the spirit. Come on, let me show you where you'll be working. And Mitchell? Don't take the colonel's attitude personally. He's particular about new officers, especially ones from West Point. As they walked through the corridors of the command building, Sarah absorbed everything around her. The walls were lined with photographs of previous commanders, unit citations, and maps of various deployment areas. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, and every surface reflected the organized efficiency of military life. Has he always been like that? Sarah asked quietly. Rodriguez glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. Colonel Harrison is a good officer, don't get me wrong. He's kept this unit running smoothly for 3 years, and he's got more combat experience than most of us combined. But he's got some strong opinions about how things should be done, and about who should be doing them. They reached a large room filled with desks, computers, and filing cabinets. Maps covered the walls, marked with pins and colored strings that tracked various ongoing operations. The space buzzed with quiet activity as soldiers worked at their stations, analyzing data, preparing reports, and coordinating with field units. "This is where you'll be working," Rodriguez said, leading her to a desk in the corner. "Lieutenant Peterson will be your immediate supervisor. He's a good guy, Ben. Here about 2 years now. He'll get you oriented with the filing system and show you how we process incoming intelligence reports." Sarah looked around the room, taking in the scope of the operation. Despite Harrison's dismissive attitude, she could see that this was serious work. The reports on the desks contained real intelligence about real operations involving real soldiers. The responsibility of it struck her with unexpected force. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lieutenant Peterson approached them, a stack of files in his hands. He was about 30 years old, with the kind of practical efficiency that came from experience, without the bitter edge she had sensed in Harrison. "You must be our new analyst," he said, extending a hand. "Mike Peterson, good to have you aboard." Sarah shook his hand gratefully. "Sarah Mitchell, thank you for the welcome." Peterson gestured to the files he was carrying. "These are yesterday's reconnaissance reports from the training exercises. Nothing classified, but they'll give you a good sense of how we organize and process field intelligence. The system might seem complex at first, but you'll get the hang of it." As Peterson began explaining the filing procedures, Sarah found herself thinking about Harrison's words. She understood his skepticism. She was young, inexperienced, and untested in the ways that mattered most in military service. But she also understood something else. Dismissing someone's potential based on assumptions was a luxury that effective leaders couldn't afford. The afternoon passed quickly as Sarah immersed herself in learning the systems and procedures that kept the intelligence unit functioning. She discovered that the work was far more complex and nuanced than Harrison had suggested. Each report required careful analysis, cross-referencing with other intelligence sources, and integration into larger operational pictures. It was exactly the kind of analytical work that had always energized her. As evening approached, Sarah found herself alone in the office, working late to familiarize herself with the filing system. The building had grown quiet, with most of the day shift having departed for dinner and personal time. She was deep in concentration when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Colonel Harrison appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Still here, Lieutenant?" Sarah stood quickly. "Yes, sir. I wanted to make sure I understood the filing system before tomorrow." Harrison entered the room and looked at the organized stacks of files on her desk. "Finding everything in order?" "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Peterson has been very helpful." Harrison picked up one of the reports Sarah had been working on and glanced at it briefly. "These are basic training exercise reports, Lieutenant. Nothing that requires a West Point education to file properly." Sarah felt the familiar sting of his dismissal, but this time she was ready for it. "Every piece of intelligence has value, sir. Even training reports can reveal patterns and insights that inform larger operational decisions. Harrison looked at her with renewed attention. Is that so? And what patterns have you discovered in these particular reports, Lieutenant? Sarah had actually noticed something interesting in the reports, but she hesitated to share it. Harrison's tone suggested he was testing her, possibly setting her up for another dismissal. But she had committed to proving herself through her work, not through avoiding challenges. The reconnaissance teams from the third training exercise showed consistently slower response times in the eastern sector, she said carefully. The reports attribute this to difficult terrain, but the GPS coordinates suggest the terrain in that sector is actually similar to the western sector, where response times were normal. It might be worth investigating whether there's an equipment issue or if the teams in that sector need additional training. Harrison studied the report more carefully, his expression shifting from skepticism to something resembling interest. And you noticed this pattern in how long? I've been reviewing these reports for about 4 hours, sir. For a moment, Harrison said nothing. Then he set the report back on her desk with a slight nod. Interesting observation, Lieutenant. I'll have Peterson follow up on it. Sarah felt a small surge of satisfaction, but she kept her expression neutral. Thank you, sir. Harrison moved toward the door, then paused. Mitchell, let me ask you something. Why did you choose military intelligence? With your academic record, you could have gone into any number of specialties. The question caught Sarah off guard. It was the first time Harrison had shown any interest in her as an individual rather than as a symbol of everything he disliked about new officers. I believe that good intelligence saves lives, sir, she said simply. The better we understand the situation, the better decisions we can make. And better decisions mean soldiers come home safely. Harrison studied her for a long moment, and Sarah thought she saw something shift in his expression. Not approval, exactly, but perhaps a recognition that her motivations were more serious than he had initially assumed. That's a noble sentiment, Lieutenant, he said finally. Let's see if you can translate noble sentiments into practical results. After he left, Sarah sat back down at her desk and continued working. She understood that one small observation wouldn't change Harrison's opinion of her, but it was a start. She had proven, if only to herself, that she could contribute meaningfully to the unit's work. As she filed the last report of the day, Sarah reflected on her first day at Fort Braxton. Harrison's dismissive attitude had stung, but it had also clarified something important for her. She wasn't here to win his approval or to prove that his assumptions about young officers were wrong. She was here to do her job, to serve her country, and to earn her place through competence and dedication. The challenge ahead was clear. She would need to prove herself not through words or credentials, but through consistent, excellent performance. Every report she filed, every analysis she conducted, every observation she made would be an opportunity to demonstrate her value to the unit. What Sarah couldn't have known that evening was that her careful analysis of the training reports would lead to the discovery of a significant equipment malfunction that could have endangered soldiers in actual combat situations. Nor could she have predicted that her methodical approach to intelligence work would eventually save lives in ways that neither she nor Harrison could have imagined. The foundation of her future success was being laid in those quiet hours of careful, detail-oriented work. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah began to understand that earning respect in the military wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about proving yourself right, one decision at a time. 3 months into her assignment at Fort Braxton, Sarah Mitchell had established herself as the most thorough analyst in the intelligence unit. Her desk had become a model of organized efficiency, with color-coded files, detailed cross-reference charts, and a system for tracking patterns that impressed even Lieutenant Peterson. But despite her consistent performance, Colonel Harrison's Attitude toward her remained unchanged. The morning briefing on October 15th started like any other. Officers gathered in the main conference room, coffee cups in hand, as Harrison reviewed the day's training schedules and operational updates. Sarah sat in the back row, taking notes and preparing to present her weekly intelligence summary. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Harrison called out, his voice carrying its usual edge of skepticism. "Your turn. What insights has our Academy graduate gleaned from this week's reports?" Sarah stood and moved to the front of the room, her presentation folder in hand. She had learned to ignore Harrison's tone and focus on delivering solid, factual analysis. "Sir, I've identified 3 significant patterns in the reconnaissance data from the past 7 days. She opened her folder and referenced her notes. First, communication delays between forward observation posts and command have increased by an average of 12 minutes during night operations. Second, equipment failure rates in the Eastern Training Sector have risen by 30% over the past month. Third, we've received 4 separate reports of unusual civilian vehicle activity near the northern perimeter of the base. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward with interest. "What kind of civilian activity?" "Vehicles with out-of-state license plates, conducting what appears to be surveillance of our security procedures," Sarah replied. The reports described the same behavior pattern: vehicles parking at vantage points for extended periods, occupants using optical equipment, and departure when approached by security patrols. Harrison's expression shifted from dismissive to attentive. "And what's your assessment of this activity, Lieutenant?" Sarah had spent considerable time analyzing this particular pattern, cross-referencing the reports with intelligence briefings about potential security threats. The timing and methodology suggest either corporate espionage related to our training contracts or preliminary reconnaissance for a more serious security threat. I recommend increasing patrol frequency in the affected areas and conducting license plate checks on any suspicious vehicles. Major Thompson, the base security chief, nodded approvingly. "Solid analysis, Lieutenant. I'll coordinate with local law enforcement to run checks on those plates." Harrison studied Sarah for a long moment before speaking. "Anything else, Mitchell?" "Yes. Sir, I've compiled a comprehensive report on the communication delays. The problem appears to be related to outdated encryption protocols that slow down message transmission during peak usage periods. I've researched potential solutions and identified 3 upgrade options that could reduce delays by up to 60%. This was new territory for Sarah. She had gone beyond simply analyzing problems to proposing solutions, stepping into the kind of strategic thinking that was typically reserved for more senior officers. She watched Harrison's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. "You've researched solutions?" Harrison's voice was carefully neutral. "On whose authority?" Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness but kept her voice steady. "On my own initiative, sir. I understood that identifying problems was only half of effective intelligence work. The other half is recommending actionable solutions." The room fell silent. Sarah was acutely aware that she had potentially overstepped her bounds, but she also believed that her analysis was sound and her recommendations were valuable. She had spent weeks developing her understanding of the base's operational challenges, and she felt ready to contribute at a higher level. Harrison set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Lieutenant, your job is to file reports and identify patterns. Strategic recommendations are made by officers with operational experience. Perhaps you've forgotten that distinction." The rebuke stung, but Sarah had grown accustomed to Harrison's dismissive attitude. What surprised her was the reaction from other officers in the room. She noticed several exchanged glances, and Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Actually, sir," Rodriguez said carefully, "the lieutenant's communication analysis identified the same issues our technical team has been struggling with for months. Her research might be worth reviewing." Harrison turned his attention to Rodriguez with a look that could have frozen water. "Captain, I don't recall asking for your assessment of Lieutenant Mitchell's work. No, sir. I was simply noting that her findings align with our technical challenges." Major Thompson leaned forward. "Colonel, if the lieutenant has identified potential solutions to our communication delays, shouldn't we at least examine her recommendations? Those delays have been affecting our training effectiveness." Sarah watched the exchange with growing understanding. The other officers weren't just being polite, they were genuinely interested in her analysis. She had assumed that Harrison's skepticism was widely shared, but she was beginning to realize that his attitude might be more personal than professional. Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Major, I appreciate your concern for training effectiveness. However, I believe it's important to maintain proper channels and appropriate levels of responsibility. Lieutenant Mitchell is an analyst, not a strategic planner." "Of course, sir," Thompson replied, but his tone suggested he disagreed with Harrison's assessment. The meeting continued with routine updates and administrative matters, but Sarah noticed that several officers approached her afterward to discuss her findings. Captain Rodriguez requested copies of her communication analysis, and Major Thompson asked for additional details about the civilian surveillance reports. Lieutenant Peterson found her at her desk later that morning, working on a new batch of intelligence reports. "That was impressive work in the briefing," he said quietly. "Your analysis of the communication delays was spot on." Sarah looked up from her files. "Thank you, but I may have overstepped by proposing solutions." Peterson glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Between you and me, half the officers in that room have been trying to solve the communication problem for months. If you've found potential solutions, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of." Colonel Harrison doesn't seem to agree. Peterson's expression became more serious. "The colonel has his own way of doing things. He's been successful using traditional approaches, and he's skeptical of change. But that doesn't mean your ideas aren't valuable." Sarah appreciated Peterson's support, but she also understood that she needed to be careful about appearing to undermine Harrison's authority. She had no interest in creating conflict. She simply wanted to contribute meaningfully to the units. Effectiveness. The afternoon brought an unexpected development. Sarah was analyzing reports from a joint training exercise when she noticed an anomaly in the patrol schedules. According to the official records, Security Team Alpha had been conducting perimeter sweeps every 2 hours throughout the previous night, but the timestamps on their check-in reports showed gaps of up to 4 hours between communications. Sarah cross-referenced the security reports with maintenance logs and discovered that Team Alpha's radio equipment had been malfunctioning intermittently for the past week. The team had been conducting their patrols as scheduled, but their check-in reports weren't being transmitted properly due to the equipment failures. The implication was significant. If security teams were patrolling but unable to communicate with command, they could encounter threats without being able to request backup or report their findings. The security gap was exactly the kind of vulnerability that could be exploited by the civilian surveillance activity she had identified. That morning, Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon documenting her findings and preparing a detailed report. She knew that Harrison would likely dismiss her conclusions, but she also knew that the security implications were too serious to ignore. She decided to present her findings to Major Thompson first, since base security fell under his jurisdiction. Thompson's office was located in the security building, a concrete structure that housed the base's monitoring equipment and communication center. When Sarah arrived, she found Thompson reviewing footage from the perimeter cameras. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Thompson said, looking up from his monitors. "What can I do for you?" "Sir, I've discovered a significant security vulnerability that relates to this morning's discussion about civilian surveillance." Sarah handed him her report. "Security Team Alpha has been operating with faulty radio equipment for the past week. They've been conducting scheduled patrols, but their communications with command have been intermittent. Thompson read through her report quickly, his expression growing more serious with each page. This is a serious problem, Lieutenant. If our security teams can't communicate with command, we're essentially blind during their patrol periods. Yes, sir, and the timing coincides with the increased civilian surveillance activity. If someone has been monitoring our security procedures, they would have noticed the communication gaps. Thompson stood up and moved to a large map of the base perimeter. Show me the specific areas where the communication failures occurred. Sarah joined him at the map and pointed to several marked locations. The failures were most frequent in the northern and eastern sectors, particularly during the overnight hours between 2200 and 0600. Those are also the areas where the civilian surveillance was most active. Thompson studied the map intently. If someone was planning to breach our perimeter, these communication gaps would give them a significant advantage. They'd know exactly when our security teams would be unable to call for backup. That's my assessment as well, sir. I recommend immediate replacement of the faulty radio equipment and possibly adjusting patrol schedules to ensure overlapping coverage during vulnerable periods. Thompson nodded decisively. I'll coordinate with the communications team to get new equipment deployed immediately. And I'll need you to brief Colonel Harrison on these findings. Sarah felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Sir, Colonel Harrison has made it clear that he prefers routine intelligence reports rather than strategic assessments. Lieutenant, this isn't about strategic planning. This is about immediate base security. The Colonel needs to understand the potential threat we're facing. Thompson was right, of course. Sarah's personal discomfort with Harrison's attitude was irrelevant when compared to the security implications of her findings. She had identified a genuine vulnerability that could compromise the safety of everyone on the base. I'll prepare a briefing for the Colonel, sir. Good, and Mitchell? This is excellent work. This kind of analytical thinking is exactly what intelligence officers should be doing. Sarah returned to her desk with mixed feelings. She was proud of her analysis and confident in her conclusions, but she dreaded the prospect of presenting her findings to Harrison. She knew that he would likely focus on her methodology rather than her results, questioning her authority to make security assessments. She spent the evening preparing her briefing, organizing her evidence, and anticipating potential objections. She practiced her presentation multiple times, ensuring that every statement was supported by documented evidence and that her recommendations were practical and actionable. The next morning, Sarah requested a meeting with Colonel Harrison. His aide scheduled her for 0800, and she arrived precisely on time with her briefing materials organized in a presentation folder. Harrison looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression showing the same mixture of skepticism and mild irritation that had become familiar. What is it, Lieutenant? Sir, I've discovered a security vulnerability that requires immediate attention. Sarah handed him a summary of her findings. Security Team Alpha has been operating with faulty radio equipment, creating communication gaps that coincide with the civilian surveillance activity I reported yesterday. Harrison read through the summary, his expression remaining neutral. And you've taken it upon yourself to conduct a security assessment? No, sir. I identified the pattern while analyzing routine intelligence reports. Major Thompson requested that I brief you on the security implications. Harrison set down the summary and looked at her directly. Lieutenant, I'm beginning to notice a pattern in your work. You seem to believe that your job extends beyond basic intelligence analysis. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. Sir, I believe my job is to provide accurate, actionable intelligence. The security vulnerability I've identified poses a genuine threat to base operations. A threat that you've identified, Harrison repeated. Tell me, Lieutenant, how many years of security experience do you have? How many bases have you helped secure? How many real threats have you assessed? The questions were rhetorical, designed to highlight her inexperience. Sarah understood that Harrison was testing her, trying to determine whether she would back down or defend her analysis. "I have no operational security experience, sir," she replied calmly. "But I have extensive training in threat assessment and pattern recognition. The evidence I've compiled is factual and verifiable." Harrison stood and walked to his window, a gesture that Sarah had learned meant he was considering how to respond. "Lieutenant, let me explain something about military intelligence. Our job is to provide information to decision-makers, not to make decisions ourselves. When you start proposing solutions and conducting security assessments, you're stepping outside your role." "I understand, sir. But when intelligence reveals an immediate threat, isn't it appropriate to bring that threat to the attention of the relevant authorities?" Harrison turned back to face her, and Sarah thought she detected a flicker of something like respect in his expression. "You're not wrong about that, Lieutenant. But the way you present your findings matters. You can't simply announce that you've discovered a security vulnerability. You need to present your analysis through proper channels and let experienced officers evaluate the implications." Sarah nodded, recognizing the validity of his point. "I understand, sir. Should I coordinate with Major Thompson to present the findings through appropriate channels?" "Major Thompson has already briefed me on your discoveries," Harrison said, "and he's requested permission to implement your recommendations regarding the radio equipment and patrol schedules." Sarah felt a surge of surprise. "He has, which brings me to my next point." Harrison returned to his desk and sat down, his posture becoming more formal. "Your analysis was thorough and your conclusions were sound. The security vulnerability you identified is real, and your recommendations are practical. Major Thompson believes that your work may have prevented a serious security breach." The admission seemed to cost Harrison some effort, but Sarah could see that he was being genuine. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad the analysis was helpful. However," Harrison continued, "I still have concerns about your approach. You're an intelligent officer, Mitchell, but intelligence alone isn't enough. Military leadership requires judgment, experience, and the ability to work within established structures. You can't simply decide that your analysis is more important than protocol." Sarah considered his words carefully. She understood that Harrison's criticism contained valid points about military hierarchy and proper procedures. At the same time, she believed that her proactive approach had identified genuine problems that might have been overlooked through routine channels. "I appreciate your feedback, sir," she said. "How would you recommend I handle similar situations in the future?" Harrison studied her for a moment, as if evaluating whether her question was genuine or merely diplomatic. "Present your analysis to your immediate supervisor first. Let Lieutenant Peterson evaluate your findings and determine the appropriate next steps. If he believes the matter requires higher-level attention, he'll coordinate with the relevant department heads." "Understood, sir." "And Mitchell, don't assume that initiative is the same thing as insubordination. There's a difference between identifying problems and circumventing the chain of command. Learn to navigate that difference." Sarah left Harrison's office with a clearer understanding of both his expectations and her own role within the unit. She had proven her analytical capabilities, but she had also learned important lessons about military protocol and the importance of working within established structures. The radio equipment was replaced that afternoon, and the security patrol schedules were adjusted to ensure continuous communication coverage. Within a week, the civilian surveillance activity ceased entirely, suggesting that Sarah's assessment had been accurate, but more importantly, Sarah had begun to understand that earning respect in the military wasn't just about being right. It was about being right in the right way, through the right channels, with the right level of respect for the experience and authority of senior officers. The foundation of her future success was being built not just through analytical excellence, but through learning to balance initiative with protocol, confidence with humility, and innovation with respect for tradition. These were lessons that would serve her well in the challenges that lay ahead. The emergency alert pierced through the quiet of Fort Braxton at 0347 hours on a frigid December morning. Sarah Mitchell jolted awake in her quarters, instantly alert, as the base-wide announcement crackled through the intercom system. All intelligence personnel were to report immediately to the command center for a priority briefing. Sarah dressed quickly in the darkness, her mind racing through potential scenarios. In her 8 months at Fort Braxton, she had never experienced a middle-of-the-night emergency mobilization. The urgency in the announcement suggested something far more serious than routine training exercises or administrative emergencies. The command center buzzed with activity as personnel streamed in from across the base. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the walls, and the air carried the tension of officers trying to assess a situation they didn't yet understand. Sarah found Lieutenant Peterson near the intelligence workstations, his face grim as he reviewed incoming reports. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low. Peterson looked up from his computer screen. "We've got a developing crisis about 60 miles northeast of here. A severe winter storm has trapped a civilian medical transport convoy in mountainous terrain. The convoy was carrying critical medical supplies to a remote hospital, but they were stranded for 6 hours, with no communication." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What kind of medical supplies? Blood products, emergency medications, and equipment for a pediatric surgery scheduled for this morning. Without those supplies, a 7-year-old girl won't survive the day. Colonel Harrison entered the command center, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. His presence immediately commanded attention, and the background chatter died away as officers turned to face him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. "We have a time-sensitive humanitarian mission. A civilian medical convoy has been stranded by severe weather conditions in the Appalachian foothills. The convoy contains critical supplies needed for an emergency pediatric surgery." He moved to a large digital map display showing the topography of the affected area. The storm has created whiteout conditions with winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. Local emergency services are unable to reach the convoy due to impassable roads and dangerous flying conditions. Sarah studied the map, noting the challenging terrain and the remoteness of the stranded convoy's location. The area was characterized by steep slopes, dense forest, and limited access roads, exactly the kind of environment that made rescue operations extremely difficult. "The hospital has requested military assistance," Harrison continued. "We have approximately 4 hours before the surgical window closes. After that point, the medical intervention will no longer be viable." Major Thompson stepped forward. "What are our options for reaching the convoy?" Harrison's expression was grave. "Standard helicopter operations are impossible due to the weather conditions. Ground vehicles can't navigate the terrain in these conditions. We need an unconventional approach." Sarah felt a surge of analytical energy as she processed the tactical challenge. She had spent months studying the topography around Fort Braxton, analyzing terrain features for training exercises and operational planning. The area where the convoy was trapped was mountainous and difficult, but she remembered several potential approach routes that might be viable. Lieutenant Peterson noticed her intense focus on the map. "Mitchell, you look like you're working on something." Sarah hesitated, remembering Harrison's previous warnings about overstepping her role. But the urgency of the situation and the life-or-death implications compelled her to speak up. "Sir, I've been analyzing the topography of that region for training exercise planning," she said, addressing Harrison directly. "There might be alternative approach routes that could work even in these weather conditions." Harrison turned to look at her, his expression showing surprise rather than the usual skepticism. Explain. Sarah moved to the map display and pointed to specific terrain features. The main access road is completely impassable, but there's a series of old logging roads that approach the area from the southeast. They're not marked on standard maps, but they show up in the geological survey data I've been using for training analysis. She traced the routes with her finger, showing how they connected to form a potential access corridor. The logging roads follow ridge lines rather than valley floors, which means they're less likely to be blocked by snowdrifts. The terrain is challenging, but specialized vehicles might be able to navigate it. Captain Rodriguez studied the map intently. How do you know about these logging roads? I've been creating detailed topographical analyses for all training areas within a 100-mile radius of the base, Sarah replied. The logging roads appear in historical land use surveys and geological mapping data. They're not maintained for regular traffic, but they exist. Harrison examined the routes Sarah had identified, his expression thoughtful. These roads would still require specialized equipment and experienced drivers. The conditions would be extremely hazardous, yes sir. But they might be our only option for reaching the convoy before the surgical deadline. Major Thompson leaned forward. Do we have vehicles capable of navigating that terrain in these conditions? We have 2 modified all-terrain vehicles designed for extreme weather operations, Harrison replied. They're equipped with specialized tires, enhanced traction systems, and cold weather modifications. But operating them in these conditions would be extremely dangerous. Sarah felt compelled to add another consideration. Sir, the convoy's exact location might affect our approach strategy. If we can determine their precise position, we might be able to identify the safest route to reach them. Harrison nodded. The convoy's last known position was transmitted 6 hours ago, but we haven't had communication since then. They could have moved or become further trapped. I might be able to help with that, Sarah said, her mind working through the possibilities. I've been tracking weather pattern data as part of my intelligence analysis. If I can correlate the storm's progression with the convoy's last known position, I might be able to estimate their most likely current location. Peterson looked at her with interest. How would you do that? Sarah moved to a computer terminal and began pulling up weather data and topographical information. The storm has been moving in a predictable pattern. If the convoy tried to find shelter, they would have looked for terrain features that provide wind protection. Based on the topography and the storm's direction, there are only a few locations where they could have sought shelter. She worked quickly, overlaying weather data with topographical maps and calculating wind patterns based on terrain features. The analysis was complex, requiring her to consider multiple variables simultaneously, but she had developed exactly these kinds of analytical skills through months of detailed intelligence work. Based on the storm progression and the available shelter options, the convoy most likely sought refuge in this area, Sarah said, pointing to a specific location on the map. It's a natural depression surrounded by rock outcroppings that would provide wind protection. Harrison studied her analysis carefully. You're confident in this assessment? Sarah felt the weight of the moment. A child's life hung in the balance, and her analysis would help determine the rescue strategy. I'm confident in the methodology, sir. The variables I've considered are all based on documented weather patterns and topographical features. Major Thompson, can our all-terrain vehicles reach that location using the logging roads Lieutenant Mitchell identified? Thompson consulted with his technical team before responding. It would be challenging, but possible. We'd need experienced drivers and specialized equipment. The operation would carry significant risk. Harrison considered the options silently for several moments. Sarah could see him weighing the risks against the potential to save a life. It was the kind of decision that separated effective leaders from those who merely followed procedures. We'll attempt the rescue, Harrison decided. Major Thompson, Prepare 2 all-terrain vehicles with full cold weather gear and emergency medical supplies. Select your most experienced drivers. Yes, sir. How large a team do we need? Minimal crew for safety reasons, Harrison replied. 2 drivers, 1 medic, and 1 officer to coordinate with the convoy once we reach them. Sarah felt a sudden surge of determination. Sir, I request permission to accompany the rescue team. The command center fell silent. Harrison stared at her with an expression she couldn't read. Lieutenant, this is a dangerous field operation, not an intelligence analysis exercise. Sir, I have the most detailed knowledge of the terrain and the route planning. If the team encounters unexpected obstacles or needs to modify the approach, my analysis could be critical. Harrison's jaw tightened. You have no field experience, Mitchell. This operation requires practical skills, not theoretical knowledge. Respectfully, sir, the route selection and terrain analysis that made this mission possible came from theoretical knowledge applied to practical problems. Sometimes theory and practice need to work together. The exchange captured the attention of everyone in the command center. Sarah realized she was challenging Harrison's authority in front of his subordinates, but she genuinely believed her expertise could contribute to the mission's success. Major Thompson cleared his throat. Colonel, the lieutenant's terrain analysis has been accurate so far. Having her available to adjust the route if conditions change might be valuable. Harrison looked around the room, noting the expressions of the other officers. Sarah could see him weighing multiple considerations: the mission's importance, the risks involved, and the precedent of allowing an inexperienced officer to participate in a dangerous operation. Very well, he said finally. Lieutenant Mitchell will accompany the rescue team as a terrain specialist. But you'll follow orders without question and stay with the vehicles at all times. This is not an opportunity for you to prove yourself. It's a life-or-death mission. Understood, sir. I won't let you down. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah equipped herself with cold weather gear, emergency supplies, and communication equipment. She reviewed her terrain analysis one final time, memorizing alternative routes and potential obstacles. The all-terrain vehicles were impressive pieces of equipment, modified with enhanced suspension systems, oversized tires, and enclosed cabs. Designed for extreme weather operations. The drivers were experienced sergeants who had operated in challenging conditions around the world. As the rescue team prepared to depart, Harrison approached Sarah privately. Lieutenant, I want to be clear about something. I'm allowing you to participate in this mission because your analysis has been valuable. But if you do anything to compromise the safety of this team or the success of this mission, there will be consequences. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I understand, sir. I won't let personal motivations interfere with the mission. Good. And Mitchell? I hope your terrain analysis is as accurate as you believe it is. Lives depend on it. The journey into the storm-ravaged mountains was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. The all-terrain vehicles navigated through snowdrifts and over rocky terrain that would have been impassable for conventional vehicles. The logging roads she had identified were barely visible under the snow, requiring constant navigation adjustments based on terrain features and GPS coordinates. Sarah rode in the lead vehicle, providing real-time route guidance based on her analysis. The conditions were even more challenging than she had anticipated, with visibility reduced to mere yards and wind gusts that threatened to push the vehicles off course. How much further to the estimated location? The driver asked, his voice tight with concentration. Sarah consulted her GPS and compared their position to her terrain analysis. Approximately 2 miles northeast, following the ridgeline. But we'll need to descend into the depression where I believe the convoy sought shelter. The descent was treacherous, requiring careful maneuvering around rock outcroppings and snow-covered obstacles. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the full magnitude of the risks they were taking. One wrong turn or mechanical failure could leave them stranded in conditions that could prove fatal. Then, through the swirling snow, Sarah spotted a faint light in the distance. "There," she said, pointing through the windshield. "That's got to be them." The rescue team found the medical convoy huddled in exactly the location Sarah had predicted. 3 vehicles were arranged in a defensive formation, using the natural terrain features to create a windbreak. The convoy personnel were cold and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. The transfer of medical supplies to the rescue vehicles proceeded quickly, with everyone understanding the time pressure they faced. The convoy's lead driver, a woman named Dr. Jennifer Adams, expressed profound gratitude for the rescue team's arrival. "We were starting to think no one would be able to reach us," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "That little girl's surgery was supposed to begin 3 hours ago." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The success of her terrain analysis had made the rescue possible, but the mission wouldn't be complete until they delivered the supplies to the hospital. The return journey proved even more challenging than the approach. The storm had intensified, and the vehicles struggled against increasingly difficult conditions. Sarah monitored their progress constantly, adjusting their route based on changing conditions and her understanding of the terrain. 2 hours after reaching the stranded convoy, the rescue team arrived at the hospital. The medical supplies were transferred immediately to the surgical team, and within minutes, the pediatric surgery was underway. Sarah stood in the hospital corridor, still wearing her cold weather gear, watching through a window as medical professionals worked to save a child's life. The analytical work she had done in the quiet confines of the intelligence office had led to this moment, a moment where theory and practice had combined to make a life-or-death difference. Colonel Harrison appeared beside her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "The surgery is going well," he said quietly. "The doctors believe the child will make a full recovery." Sarah nodded, feeling emotionally drained from the intensity of the experience. "I'm glad we were able to help." Harrison studied her for a moment. "Your terrain analysis was exceptional, Lieutenant. Without your knowledge of those logging roads, we never would have reached the convoy in time." "Thank you, sir. I'm just glad the analysis was accurate." "It was more than accurate," Harrison said. "It was innovative, thorough, and applied under extreme pressure. You demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking that saves lives." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but also a deeper understanding of what military service really meant. It feels different when the analysis has immediate, life-or-death consequences. "That's the reality of military intelligence work," Harrison replied. "Every report you file, every pattern you identify, every recommendation you make has the potential to affect real people in real situations." Today you experienced that reality firsthand. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the medical team work. Sarah reflected on how much had changed her first day at Fort Braxton. She had proven her analytical capabilities, but more importantly, she had learned to apply those capabilities in service of something larger than herself. "Sir," she said eventually, "I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this mission. I know it was a risk." Harrison looked at her with an expression that contained something she had never seen before: respect. "Lieutenant Mitchell, you've earned your place on this team. Your work today exemplifies the best of military intelligence, using analytical skills to solve practical problems and save lives. That's what being an officer is really about." As they walked back toward the vehicles for the return journey to Fort Braxton, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with Harrison. She had proven herself not through confrontation or defiance, but through competence, dedication, and the willingness to put her skills in service of others. The foundation for her future success had been laid through months of careful work. But Today she had demonstrated that her analytical abilities could translate into real-world impact. It was a lesson that would serve her well in the challenges ahead, challenges that would eventually lead her to positions of greater responsibility and authority. But for now, she was content to be a lieutenant who had helped save a child's life. Through the application of careful analysis and determined action. It was enough, and it was everything. 7 years after first walking through the gates of Fort Braxton as a dismissed lieutenant, Colonel Sarah Mitchell returned to the same installation, this time as its new commanding officer. The promotion ceremony had taken place 3 weeks earlier at the Pentagon, where she became the youngest officer ever to receive command of a major intelligence installation. The morning was crisp and clear as Sarah's vehicle approached the main gate. She studied the familiar landscape through the window, remembering the nervous young officer who had once stood on this same asphalt, uncertain of her place in the military hierarchy. Now she was returning to lead the very institution where she had once been mocked and dismissed. The base looked different through the eyes of a commanding officer. Every building, every training facility, every operational center was now her responsibility. The weight of command settled on her shoulders as she realized that the effectiveness and safety of over 3,000 personnel would depend on her leadership decisions. Major Jennifer Torres, her new deputy commander, met her at the administration building. "Welcome to Fort Braxton, Colonel Mitchell. The staff is assembled for your arrival briefing." Sarah nodded, adjusting her uniform one final time before stepping into her new role. "Thank you, Major. I'm looking forward to working with the team." They walked through corridors that Sarah remembered from her earliest days at the base, past the same offices where she had once filed intelligence reports and analyzed reconnaissance data. The familiar surroundings felt surreal as she prepared to address the assembled staff as their commanding officer. The main briefing room was packed with officers and senior enlisted personnel, representing every department and operational unit on the base. Sarah recognized several faces from her previous assignment, including Captain Peterson, who had been promoted and now served as the Chief Intelligence Officer. At the back of the room, she spotted a familiar figure that made her pause momentarily. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison stood with the other senior staff, his expression neutral but attentive. He had been promoted since her departure and now served as the base's operations commander, which meant he would be reporting directly to her. Sarah moved to the podium, looking out at the assembled personnel who would be implementing her vision for the base's future operations. Many of them had served under her predecessor for years and would be evaluating her leadership style and decision-making capabilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority she had developed through years of progressive responsibility. "I'm honored to have been selected to command Fort Braxton. This installation has a distinguished history of excellence in intelligence operations and training, and I intend to build upon that foundation." She paused, making eye contact with personnel throughout the room. "However, I also believe that excellence requires continuous innovation and adaptation. The threats we face today are more complex and dynamic than ever before, and our response must be equally sophisticated." Sarah outlined her vision for enhancing the base's intelligence capabilities while maintaining the operational excellence that had defined Fort Braxton's reputation. Her plans incorporated lessons learned from the Modernization Initiative and the cybersecurity crisis, demonstrating how experience had shaped her leadership philosophy. "Most importantly," she concluded, "this command will be built on the principle that every member of our team has valuable contributions to make, regardless of rank or experience level. Innovation and excellence can come from any source, and our job as leaders is to recognize and nurture that potential." The statement was a direct reference to her own experience as a young officer whose ideas had initially been dismissed. Several personnel in the audience nodded approvingly, understanding the inclusive leadership approach she was establishing. After the briefing, Sarah began the traditional round of individual meetings with her senior staff. Each department head presented their operational status, ongoing challenges, and recommendations for improvement. The meetings provided insight into the base's current capabilities while allowing Sarah to assess the leadership team she had inherited. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's meeting was scheduled for late afternoon. Sarah prepared for the encounter with mixed emotions, remembering both the frustration of his early dismissiveness and the respect that had eventually developed between them. Harrison entered her office, the same office where he had once questioned her qualifications and dismissed her potential. The role reversal was complete, but Sarah felt no sense of vindication or triumph. Instead, she felt the weight of responsibility for leading an officer whose experience and capability she genuinely respected. "Colonel Mitchell," Harrison said, his bearing professional and respectful, "congratulations on your appointment. Fort Braxton is fortunate to have your leadership." Sarah gestured for him to take a seat, noting how comfortable he appeared, despite the dramatic shift in their professional relationship. "Thank you, James. I'm looking forward to working with you as my operations commander." The use of his first name established a tone of professional collegiality while acknowledging their shared history. Sarah had learned that effective leadership required balancing authority with accessibility, formality with genuine human connection. "I've reviewed your operational reports," Sarah continued, "and I'm impressed with the efficiency improvements you've implemented over the past 2 years. The training protocols you've developed have significantly enhanced readiness levels." Harrison nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Colonel. I've tried to incorporate some of the analytical approaches you pioneered during your previous assignment. Here, your emphasis on data-driven decision-making has proven very effective." Sarah felt a moment of quiet satisfaction, recognizing how her early innovations had influenced the base's operations, even in her absence. But she also understood that past achievements were less important than future performance. "James, I want to discuss my expectations for the operations command. I need a deputy who can implement complex initiatives while maintaining existing excellence. The role requires someone who can balance innovation with proven methods." Harrison leaned forward slightly, his expression showing genuine interest in her leadership approach. "What kind of initiatives are you considering?" Sarah had spent weeks developing her strategic plan for Fort Braxton, incorporating lessons learned from her Pentagon assignment and her experience with large-scale intelligence operations. "We're going to pilot next-generation training protocols that integrate virtual reality simulations with live exercises. We'll also be implementing advanced analytical systems that provide real-time assessment of training effectiveness." She outlined her vision for transforming Fort Braxton into a model installation that other bases would study and emulate. The plans were ambitious but achievable, requiring exactly the kind of experienced leadership that Harrison could provide. "Your role would be crucial to success," Sarah continued. "I need someone who understands both the technical requirements and the human factors involved in implementing significant change." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "I'd be honored to support these initiatives, Colonel. Your track record with innovation and implementation speaks for itself." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering operational details and strategic objectives. Sarah found herself impressed with Harrison's thoughtful questions and practical insights. He had evolved considerably since her early days at the base, developing the kind of balanced perspective that made him an ideal deputy commander. As their meeting concluded, Harrison stood to leave but paused at the door. "Colonel, may I make a personal observation?" "Of course." Harrison turned back to face her, his expression serious but respectful. 7 years ago, I failed to recognize exceptional potential because I allowed assumptions and biases to cloud my judgment. That failure could have deprived the military of outstanding leadership." Sarah felt the weight of his admission, understanding the professional courage it required for a senior officer to acknowledge such a significant error in judgment. "I want you to know," Harrison continued, "that watching your career progression has taught me important lessons about leadership and recognition of talent. You've become exactly the kind of commander this installation needs." Sarah stood and moved around her desk, extending her hand to Harrison. "James, your eventual recognition and support were crucial to my development. Sometimes the most valuable mentorship comes through challenge and earned respect rather than easy approval." They shook hands, two experienced officers who had learned to respect each other's capabilities and judgment through years of professional interaction. "I look forward to working together," Sarah said. "We're going to accomplish great things here." As Harrison left her office, Sarah walked to the window that overlooked the training grounds where she had once watched soldiers with a mixture of nervousness and determination. Now she was responsible for every aspect of their preparation and effectiveness. The young lieutenant who had been mocked for her inexperience had become the colonel, commanding the installation where her career began. But more importantly, she had developed the leadership capabilities necessary to guide Fort Braxton through the challenges of an increasingly complex security environment. Sarah's promotion to command represented more than personal achievement. It demonstrated that the military could recognize and develop talent regardless of initial assumptions or traditional expectations. Her success had opened doors for other innovative officers, while proving that analytical excellence could translate into effective command leadership. The circle was complete, but it was also just the beginning. As Colonel Sarah Mitchell began her tenure as commanding officer of Fort Braxton, she carried with her the lessons learned through years of proving herself one decision at a time. Those lessons would guide her as she led the installation toward new levels of excellence, while mentoring the next generation of officers who would shape the future of military intelligence. The mockery had become command, the dismissal had become leadership, and the young officer who had once been underestimated had become exactly what she had always possessed the potential to become: an exceptional leader ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.